Our presentation is comparing the life systems of the common mushroom and the pigeon. Both organisms share the same domain, eukarya, but they quickly separate into their own organism. Pigeons are one type of bird species that go through courtship, so they have to court a female before they're able to reproduce. And another thing is that pigeons mate for life, so as long as their partner stays alive and well, a pigeon will only have one mate forever. And pigeons have an interesting reproductive system. So both the males and the females have something called coccal protuberances. And the pigeons touch these protrusions together, and the insemination of the female occurs quickly, really quickly. It usually only takes about half a second, and it enters her reproductive tract. So like most birds, pigeons lay eggs, and after the insemination, the egg forms in the ovary until about 2 weeks later when it's laid. So going a little deeper into the reproductive organs, male pigeons have no external sex organs. During breeding season, they have 2 internal testes that swell and produce sperm. The female reproductive system, however, is pretty interesting. Female pigeons only have 1 ovary when most mammals have 2. So in the ovary, they have all the egg cells they need to reproduce for their whole life. And like most reproduction, the females have an ovulated egg that gets fertilized by the male in the oviduct and then rests in the ovary until it is laid. Okay, so moving on to the reproduction of the mushroom. It's pretty interesting too. The mushrooms can reproduce sexually and asexually. So to reproduce asexually, the mushrooms can undergo budding or asexual spore formation. So during budding, a small outgrowth comes from the fungi, which is directly identical to the parents, and it'll eventually fall off and be its own organism. This is why when you see mushrooms, you often see them in a large grouping. And then the second type of asexual reproduction is asexual spore formation. Hundreds of tiny spores are produced and then pushed into the atmosphere by the mushroom. These microscopic spores are very tough and travel as far or as little as they want and grow wherever it is suitable for them. Once they reach the ground, they form structures called hyphae under the ground to aid in their growth and form new organisms. So like in this diagram, you see you have the new fungus and then it grows to its adulthood, you could say. And then the spores will travel wherever, like through weather, they'll travel on bugs until they reach their destination. And then that's where they plant themselves, and then they grow like hyphae and it forms a new organism. So for sexual reproduction, it takes place like in the mushroom itself in structures called basidia. So 2 spores from different mushrooms come together to form the basidia, which results in something called binucleate hyphae. And then the nuclei from the 2 spores fuse and go through meiosis to create new spores with both the nuclei. So then the new spore falls off and goes through spore formation and grows with the hyphae to form a new mushroom. So overall, we can see that the pigeon and the common mushroom do have a few similarities. Both the pigeon and the common mushroom are able to reproduce sexually, and also the mushroom's able to reproduce asexually. And neither of them have external sex organs. The mushroom, again, carries out its reproduction through spores and hyphae, and the pigeons have openings on their bodies that allow for the reproduction and the ovary to hold their eggs. Pigeons, like most animals, have a specific time during the year that is their mating season. But mushrooms, on the other hand, are able to reproduce whenever their spores fall off at any time during the year. So although these organisms are very different, their reproductive systems do share some similarities.
Okay, so for this part of the presentation, I will be covering the nutrition aspects of both these organisms. Starting with the pigeons, they're heterotrophs, meaning that they make their own food. First, I wanted to go over like the main components of their diets, which consist of seeds and grains, along with fruits, vegetables, and small organisms such as insects and earthworms. However, because of their introduction into urban areas, they will readily consume really anything edible that they find on the streets. In terms of their digestive system, it's relatively similar to that of our digestive system due to the fact that they use an alimentary canal and digestive glands and enzymes. Pigeons have 3 steps within their digestive process. The first one is ingestion. In this step, the food is picked up by the pigeon and put into its mouth, which is simply just a space with no teeth, creating the upper and lower beak. Then the food goes into the mouth cavity and pharynx, where the mouth cavity contains their tongue, which is covered with mucus and few taste buds. It also contains the gullet, which is an opening for the food to travel into the esophagus. Now that the food has entered into the esophagus, the second step of the pigeon's digestive process, known as digestive, actually begins. Within digestion, the food is being broken down into nutrients that can be absorbed by the pigeon. The esophagus is simply just a tube that runs down the pigeon's neck and enlarges to form a sac at its end. This sac is called the crop and plays a role in storing the ingested food. The size of the crop is important because it allows the pigeon to eat large amounts of food at a time. The food in the crop can also be used to feed their young. From the crop, the food enters the first part of the stomach called the proventriculus, where the food is broken down by the release of hydrochloric acid and pepsin from the gastric glands. Then the food enters into the second part of the stomach called the gizzard, and this is where the pigeon's mechanical digestion takes place since they don't have teeth. The gizzard's tough and muscular walls, along with small stones that were swallowed by the bird, act as teeth in breaking down their food. Now from the stomach, the food enters into the intestine. When flowing through the duodenum, bile and pancreatic enzymes further break down the food. From the duodenum, the food is completely broken down and passed into the ileum, where the nutrients are further absorbed. Then the waste from the food goes to the rectum, where water is absorbed and fibers are torn apart from the cacal juice produced by the cacal glands. The last stage of the pigeon's digestive process is known as egestion. The waste produced, otherwise known as feces, doesn't exit instantly from the bird's rectum. Instead, the feces goes into the cloaca, where the feces is mixed with urine and released through what is called the cloacal aperture. Now here is just a few diagrams of what the inside of the digestive system looks like. Here is a pretty good picture of the crop, which I think was pretty cool. So now I'm going to tell you about the common mushroom and how it obtains their nutrients. The common mushroom is neither an autotroph or heterotroph. It is a decomposer. More specifically, it's a saprophyte, meaning it obtains its nutrients by breaking down the dead and decaying organic matter around them. Because it is a fungus, they don't have stomachs and therefore rely on other mechanisms to break down their food. Their anatomy is interesting in the fact that most of it is hidden underground. The underground part of the common mushroom is made up of a webbing full of tiny filaments. These filaments are called the hyphae, which play a major role in breaking down and absorbing their nutrients. All of the hyphae put together make up the mycelium of the mushroom, as seen in this diagram. These tiny filaments are shot out by the common mushroom in order to enlarge the surface area they are exposed to get more nutrients. And so here is just a diagram of how the hyphae secrete specific enzymes, they break down the food, and then the nutrients is absorbed through its cell wall. So overall, the common mushroom's process of getting nutrients is fairly simple because they just rely on their hyphae to break down and absorb the non-living matter around them. So now in comparing the nutrition of these two life systems, it's evident that they're very different from each other. However, there are a few similarities that exist between them. One of them is that they both are not autotrophs, meaning that they have to get their nutrients through another mechanism. The other similarity that I came up with is that they both use enzymes to break down their food, because without the secretion of enzymes, the food would remain intact and the nutrients would not be accessible. Now, in looking at the difference between their digestive processes, the biggest distinction between them would have to be that the pigeon has a full digestive system while the mushrooms just simply rely on their hyphae to absorb their food. And the digestive system of the pigeon is just much more complex, given that it's a much more complex organism in general, whereas the mushroom only needs its underground structures to do so. Going along with this, it is also evident that the pigeon is a heterotroph and the common mushroom is a decomposer. This is important to note because while they both are not autotrophs, the way in which they get their nutrients is different. And lastly, because they have different digestive processes, their diets are different as well. So ultimately, when comparing the life systems of both of these organisms, it's true that the differences heavily outweigh their similarities. And that's it.